Good day and welcome. As we continue into a new week, looking at the Paul's epistle to the Ephesians, and we've been in the second portion for some time where he talks about the practical application of the Christian principles to our day-to-day life. And as we've seen in chapter 5 and now into chapter 6, he kind of focuses even more specifically, almost microscopically, upon those three key areas of our life that have the greatest impact upon our own personal happiness. And that is the relationship dynamics that we go through. As so far we've talked about the most important relationship we have, and that is of marriage. There is no relationship that is more intense and demands more sacrifice in order to be successful than that of a marriage relationship. A husband is given the daunting responsibility of loving his wife as Christ has loved his church, and women are given an equally challenging responsibility to respect their husband in the way the church reverences and respects Christ. And so each of us fulfill those obligations not by judging or deciding based upon the actions or behaviors exclusively of the other one, but rather primarily upon our relationship with Christ, that we, in our efforts to honor Christ as husbands and as wives, we look first to his leadership and then we follow his guidance in how to interact with the person that we have become married to. And so that's important. The second area we looked at was basically the family relationship, the mother, parent, and child relationship, which has its own set of challenges. The basis of effective parenting really is for a husband and wife to be loving and respecting each other. And if they do that naturally and genuinely, it will become evident within the home, and that will become the foundation upon which children are raised. They're taught to be respectful and to be loving based upon the evidence or the example that they see being set before them. And again, it's an extremely challenging responsibility because, as Paul would say in his letter to Timothy, that it's a responsibility for the parents to lay up for the children, provide for them, prepare them, because ultimately their lives become, in large part, our legacy. And I would say that particularly in the Christian community, but in humanity as a whole, this is where people have experienced some of their greatest joys and victories and some of their greatest defeats, as their children either follow paths that are honoring to God and to their parents, or they reject that and go in a different way. Unfortunately, we live in a culture which doesn't have a very balanced perspective on family life. We like to say things like there's no such thing as bad kids, they're just bad parents. And the people who say that are people who aren't parents, because one of the things you realize really quickly is that parents many times can do all the right things. I mean, on balance, nobody's perfect, but you say 80% of the time they did the right thing. They fed their kids, they housed their kids, they clothed them, they provided for them, they educated them, and that in itself is a major sacrifice and circumstance, because they say today, it's probably even more today, but I remember last time I looked, they said it costs about $180,000 to raise a child from 0 to 18 years of age. And so you realize there's a tremendous investment and sacrifice that we make in order to raise our kids. And yet it's also becomes very challenging because we are sinners, our kids are sinners, and we live in a sinful world. Well, to say all that way by transition, we want to look at the third area. And when I'm teaching on this, usually within the church, I point out that even though it talks about slaves and masters, the contemporary application of that is for employees and employers. And we'll get into that a little further as we go into the rest of the passages dealing with this. But more importantly, I think, because today, I don't know if you've noticed, is Martin Luther King Day, and I don't know whether that's just simply coincidental or that's by divine design. I really think it would be appropriate to begin with a discussion about slavery and racism, to kind of put those things in somewhat of a historical perspective. In many ways, because something that Time Magazine did, or New York Times did a while ago, they published a book called 1619 Project, and it's a book that is not not a history book. It claims to be historical, but it's really intentionally a distortion of history. The Marxist author who wrote it really has a design of causing upheaval and racial strife, really, and all the motivation behind it, I guess in the end, that only she can answer to the motivations. But it's kind of amazing because every major historian, we're talking into the hundreds around the country, have said this is not historically accurate in any way, shape, or form. And what the book claimed was basically that America was founded to preserve slavery because it was being outlawed in Europe and other places. That on its face is not actually true, but secondarily, because slavery wasn't outlawed in Europe until the 19th century and around the world. In many places, slavery still has not been outlawed, which is surprising to many people. But Paul began here by saying in Ephesians 6:5, he says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters." And again, as I said, I think the modern equivalent of that would be employee-employee relationships. But we also have to understand that slavery, which to us in America is kind of an abstraction, by that I mean we have the concept, but we don't really have the experience. And in some ways that hinders us in our ability to understand the relationship of slave and master that exists between us and God. I think in America, where we have such a justified repulsion to the idea of slavery, the concept of us being the bond slaves of Christ causes such a basically a glitch in our brains that we have found that most of the translators have taken slave out and translated the word that's used there as servants. And in our culture, a servant is a person who is an employee who has a certain status. But this is not talking about that we have been bought with a price, which is the language of the slave auction. And we have been purchased by the blood of Christ. We've been purchased out of the slavery to sin into the slavery to Christ. The failure to grasp that has caused many people to think I've been brought out of the slavery of sin, and now I'm free to do whatever I want and to live any way I want. And that really violates the whole sense of the text. The Bible is simply saying, I was born in the slavery to sin. Christ broke the power of sin and has called me to enslave myself to a good, just, and righteous master. And yet I am here to obey. Jesus said, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And that's really, central to everything that Paul says in terms of people who are Christians and were enslaved. In fact, it's estimated that half of the believers, especially in the city of Rome, were in fact slaves who had come to Christ. And we have accounts of even some places where the church was actually pastored by a slave. Now, what we need to understand is that slavery in the ancient world, and even up until modern times, I would say even up until the Civil War, was about economics, not about race. That slavery existed all through the Greco-Roman world, it existed in the Arabic world, it existed in Africa, it existed in China and Asia. Slavery has been part of the human experiment, if you will, since the earliest days that we can note. And that's why going back in the Old Testament, we find that the institution of slavery is alive and well, even in the life of the patriarchs, because it wasn't considered to be an evil institution. In many cases, people who were put into slavery were put there by the fact that their parents had sold them in order to generate funds to feed themselves. So in some contexts, it was more of an indenturement than an actual enslavement. And yet, because people are evil, there are people who just love to have that kind of power over another person. And so I'm not trying to soft sell the idea of slavery from ancient times. It's always been an oppressive and often humiliating and debasing institution that led many people to early deaths, which they welcomed because their existence was so torturous. So when we talk about slavery, we have to understand that it was something that was going on. In fact, right now today, estimates are around 46 million people are living in some kind of enslavement. Most of that is in Marxist countries, places like North Korea and China. It's all in the news about what the North Koreans are doing, but also the Chinese and with the Uyghurs and they believe as many as 1 million of them are in slave labor camps, building knickknacks, putting together cell phones that you and I buy, and other things of that nature. These people are virtual slaves. They have no freedom. They have no rights. They can't control their destiny at all. Secondly, and maybe even more so, is in the Muslim world, where slavery has never been outlawed. Most people don't realize in Islam, slavery is still allowed. It's not prohibited at all. And we find in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, even Iran. But even the most, I think, egregious may be in India itself with its caste system. The Indian caste system has at the very bottom what are people who are called the Dalits. We refer to them in the West as the untouchables, because that's how they were viewed. And basically, these people have no rights. Now, in their constitution, the caste system is outlawed. In the constitution of India, slavery is outlawed. But in practical everyday life, nothing has changed. For the most part, it's run by the caste system, because the people who are in the top caste, the Brahmin caste, make up only 7% of the economy or the population, but they control 90% of the economy. And so at the very base, you have these people who they work on these plantations, these farms, and these various cities, basically whole communities that are owned by the wealthy Brahmins, and their job is to work in their fields and harvest their crops and tend for their cattle and all the rest. And they're just given enough money to keep alive, but they're never allowed to really get educated and go forward. In fact, there's a number of cases where Brahmins have been accidentally touched by a Dalit, and they have beaten that person to death, and there have been no legal action taken against them. And again, I wouldn't say that's characteristic of India as a whole, but pretty much when you have 300 million people, about a third of your country, are living in the condition of being a Dalits and having movement forward blocked so that they're held into the lowest positions in the culture, with the least access to freedom and healthcare and economic gain and so forth, and forced to work for those who have all those resources. That is its own kind of slavery. And so it's alive and well in the world. And it's a tragic thing, because if you throw in the 300 million Dalits, that means that we have almost 500 million of the population on the planet is living in some form of enslavement. But I think when we look at it in our situation, I often like to point out that slavery in America is one of two great blights for which I think God brings judgment. In fact, it was Abraham Lincoln and many others of the abolitionist corps who really believed that the Civil War was God's judgment on America because of the shame of slavery. And at the end of the Civil War, there's probably around 4.4 million African Americans who were held in slavery and suddenly were released. So that it's one of those things we look at and go 4 million people, and that's the really a conservative count, because you look at the whole period of the American story. You begin in 1790 and go all the way to the when the Constitution was finalized, and you go all the way to 1860. There were probably maybe twice that amount of people, although slavery didn't become really prolific until probably 40 to 50 years before the Civil War. And the reason was real simple. Cotton became a very profitable product to sell to Europe, and the way of harvesting it efficiently and basically farming large tracts of land was to employ slaves. The costs were low. They could increase their production. And so at its beginning, and that's hard, it was economic in basis. It was all about increasing the wealth. It was really after the Civil War when those black people were suddenly released, and many of them were being put into positions of authority over the whites, especially in the South, where many of them were in the American military. Many of them were going into political office and taking over the positions of power, that there grew this real threat and hatred, unjustifiably, sinfully, wickedly nonetheless, but and gave breed to things like the Ku Klux Klan, the white supremacy movements, and some of those things that we see still. They represent a very microscopic point of the population, but nonetheless, they are people who are really twisted and distorted and are being led in the wrong direction. And I say that in this regard because if we look at that as how bad it is, I think that there's a second historical blight, which I think is abortion, that also is, I think, going to be an occasion for God's judgment against this country. 63 million babies who have been aborted in the last 40 years in the United States alone. Almost 2 billion in the world have been aborted. But of those 63 million, do you realize that 20% of them were African Americans? That the African American population has been robbed of a significant, about 12 million or more people that would be African Americans, people of color in America today, that aren't there because of abortion. And keep in mind, Planned Parenthood was established by Margaret Sanger as a way of eliminating people of color. That was her goal. Her Planned Parenthood was a plan to get rid of any kind of parents of color and the children that they might produce. But I want to finish up, and I've gone quite a long time, and I'll have to pick this up tomorrow, but it's important that we understand that Christianity was the first and only religion that not only set out to regulate and later challenge the idea of slavery, but it was ultimately the Christians who led the crusade to make slavery illegal. And this is part of our heritage that we don't hear about, but it's important we understand. Well, I've gone on quite a while. I hope this is informative. I'll pick this up tomorrow because there's a few other things I still have to say I think are important for us as Christians to understand. God bless and go in His grace.